They sealed this account under ice and iron, stamped with dates that no longer exist on any official map. I am writing it now because the cold never left me, not after all these years. In 1900, we were told the Arctic was empty land, a blank page for empires to fight over in silence. That was a lie. We were soldiers sent north for a border conflict that history barely remembers. But the war we stumbled into was older than nations, older than uniforms. Beneath the ice, something had been waiting. When the ground began to move and the snow screamed like a living thing, our commanders called it an earthquake. We knew better. This is the truth they buried with the dead. Welcome to Combat Lore Files, where the shadows of war live on. Hit subscribe and get nightly drops of stories like this. They never stamped these orders with a destination, only a temperature warning and a red seal that meant do not ask questions. The envelope slid across the table with a sound I still hear in my sleep, paper scraping against scarred oak, final and deliberate. It was December of 1900, the kind of winter that crept into your bones even indoors. The barracks smelled of coal smoke, wet wool, and men who had been waiting too long for something terrible to happen. My gloves were still damp from snow when I took the envelope, the wax seal unbroken, stamped with an emblem I didn't recognize. Not my nation's crest. Not anyone's. That should have been the first warning. My commanding officer did not meet my eyes. He stood rigid, jaw clenched, like a man reading his own sentence aloud. "You are being reassigned," he said. "No congratulations. No explanation. Just that flat tone soldiers use when they know the words will not help." I broke the seal with my thumb. Inside were orders written in 3 languages, each identical in meaning but not in spirit. A multinational expedition, Arctic region, securing territory under military authority. Support scientific observers. Maintain silence. The final line was handwritten, cramped and hurried, as if added after the rest was approved. Be advised of anomalous conditions beneath the ice. I read that line twice, then a third time, feeling a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Anomalous was not a word men used lightly in those days. It meant something had been seen, measured, or buried. When I looked up, my officer finally spoke again. Quieter now. "You'll depart within 48 hours. Burn this after memorizing." I asked him what anomalies meant. He shook his head once. "It means you're not going south." 2 days later, I stood on a steel-decked transport ship cutting through black water, the sky above us low and colorless like old bone. Men from half a dozen nations stood shoulder to shoulder, uniforms different, faces the same. No one spoke much. When we did, our breath came out in thick clouds that drifted and vanished like unfinished thoughts. There were soldiers, engineers, artillery specialists, and a handful of men in civilian coats who never gave their names. They carried instruments instead of rifles and guarded them like children. The farther north we traveled, the quieter the world became. The sea hardened into slush, then ice, the hull grinding forward with a sound like teeth gnawing on stone. The cold was not sharp. It was heavy. It pressed down on us, squeezing the air from our lungs, slowing our thoughts. By the time we disembarked, my fingers felt carved from wood. The land greeted us without ceremony. Endless white, no trees, no landmarks, just snow, ice, and a horizon that refused to stay still. We marched inland in staggered columns, sleds dragging behind us, boots crunching in a rhythm that echoed too clearly. Sound traveled strangely there. A cough carried for miles. A drop tool rang out like a gunshot. Within the first hour, one of the engineers laughed nervously and said his compass was spinning. We all checked ours. Needles wavered, trembled, then settled pointing in different directions. The officers blamed magnetism, solar interference, anything that fit inside a textbook. Still, orders came to keep moving. At night, the cold grew intelligent. That is the only way I can describe it. Crept into tents, into seams and breath and thought. I lay awake listening to the ice shift beneath us, slow groans rising from deep below the surface, like a massive body adjusting its weight. Sometimes there were cracks, sharp and sudden, that made men reach for rifles before they were fully awake. Other times there were long, drawn-out sounds, almost like distant horns carried on the wind. When I mentioned this to a sergeant from another unit, he told me the locals had names for noises like that. Then he crossed himself and refused to say more. On the third day, we encountered our first guides, Inuit men who had agreed to lead us partway inland. They took our supplies but would not look at our faces. One of them traced a symbol in the snow with a gloved finger, a shape like a broken circle, then wiped it away quickly as if afraid it might be seen. Through a translator, he said the land ahead was not empty. It was sleeping. Our officers dismissed this as superstition, but they shortened the march that day anyway. That night, the sky burned green with aurora, curtains of light rippling silently overhead. Beautiful, they said. I thought it looked like something bleeding behind glass. I woke before dawn to a sensation I cannot fully explain, as if the ground beneath me had inhaled. My tent canvas was dusted with fine frost, patterns etched into it that did not look natural, lines and curves repeating like deliberate marks. Outside, men stood silently, staring at the horizon. No one gave the order to assemble. We simply did. Somewhere far ahead, beneath the ice, something moved. Not the random shift of glaciers. This was slow, purposeful, as if the land itself was turning to face us. I remember thinking then that wars usually announce themselves with noise, with banners and gunfire. This one did not. It watched us approach in silence, letting us come closer with every step. As we crossed deeper into the frozen interior, the land itself began to show signs it did not want us there. The ice did not break like something dying. It sounded like something waking up. We moved again at first light, though light was a generous word for that gray Arctic dawn. The horizon barely separated sky from ground, and everything between them seemed flattened, pressed thin by cold. Our column advanced slower now, not because of orders, but because every man felt it, that wrongness beneath our boots. The snow no longer crunched the same way. Sometimes it rang hollow, like we were walking over a buried roof. Other times it felt soft, breathing back when we stepped down, as if the ground resisted being touched. I kept my rifle close, though I could not have explained what I expected to shoot. The sound came first near midday. A low groan rolled through the ice, deep enough that it vibrated in my teeth. It was not sharp like cracking glaciers I had heard in training reels. This was drawn out, deliberate, like stone grinding against stone far below us. The column halted without an order. Even the officers froze, listening. Somewhere ahead, the sound rose again, longer this time, followed by a distant echo that reminded me of a horn blown underwater. One of the civilian observers dropped to a knee and pressed his ear to the ice. He went pale and stood back up without a word. We resumed marching, but the silence had changed. Felt crowded. By afternoon, the guides began to lag behind. They spoke rapidly among themselves, voices tight with fear. One of them, the eldest, finally stopped altogether. He planted his staff into the snow and refused to move. Through the translator, he said we had reached the edge of the breathing ground. Beyond this point, he told us, the old ones below could hear footsteps. He said their stories spoke of a war buried under ice, of giants who slept standing upright in frozen halls. The officers scoffed, but they paid the men and dismissed them anyway. No one wanted guides who believed the earth itself was an enemy. When the Inuit turned back, they did not wave. They walked fast, as if afraid something might follow them if they lingered. Without them, we relied on instruments that no longer agreed with one another. Compasses spun uselessly. Survey flags placed an hour earlier appeared crooked or displaced when we checked them again. Once, I could swear a marker we planted had been pushed over from below, the snow around it bulging outward. As evening approached, the temperature dropped suddenly, violently, like a door slamming shut. Breath crystallized in the air. Frost crept across metal in seconds. We established a forward outpost on what appeared to be a stable ice shelf, driving anchors deep and setting perimeter lines. The men worked quickly, nervously, tools clanging too loudly in the stillness. Every few minutes, the ice groaned again, closer now, the vibration running up through my legs and into my spine. It felt less like random stress and more like pressure being applied and released. At dusk, the horns returned. There was no mistaking them now. Long, resonant calls echoing through the glaciers, layered atop one another, as if answered from different depths. They were not signals meant for us. That much was clear. These were communications. Night fell fully, and with it came a sense of being surrounded despite the endless openness. The aurora shimmered weakly overhead, green light flickering like a dying signal flare. Inside the outpost tents, men whispered prayers in half a dozen languages. Some drank, others cleaned rifles that would never be warm enough to fire properly. I stepped outside to take watch and felt the ground shift beneath me, subtle but undeniable. Snow slid off nearby ridges in slow, silent curtains. Then came the tremor. Not a violent quake, but a rolling movement, as if the ice sheet itself were turning over in its sleep. Tents swayed. Equipment rattled. A stack of crates toppled without a sound. Beneath it all was that groan again, deeper than before, closer, full of weight. I dropped to one knee, palm pressed flat against the ice. It was warm, not surface warmth from friction or movement, but a faint, unnatural heat rising from below. I yanked my hand back as if burned. All around the camp, men shouted, pointing at fractures racing across the snow like dark veins. The cracks stopped short of the perimeter, then slowly sealed themselves, edges grinding together with a noise that made my stomach twist. Nothing emerged, nothing attacked, and that was somehow worse. It felt like a warning issued calmly and without emotion. The horns sounded one last time, so close now that my chest vibrated with the note. Then silence fell heavier than before. No wind, no shifting ice, just men breathing too loudly and waiting for something that did not come. We stood watch until dawn, weapons ready, eyes burning, nerves stretched thin. Somewhere during that long night, I realized we were no longer advancing into unknown territory. We were standing on it. When the first outpost vanished without a single gunshot, Command realized this was no ordinary enemy. The camp was there at dusk, lit and guarded, and by dawn it was simply gone, as if the ice had decided to forget it ever existed. The disappearance did not announce itself with screams or gunfire. That is what unsettled us most. The forward outpost lay less than 3 miles from our position, a reinforced camp established on what engineers had certified as solid shelf ice. We had exchanged signal flares with them the previous night, red and white arcs cutting briefly through the darkness. Their final flare burned steady and calm. Nothing about it suggested fear. At first light, when no runner arrived and no smoke rose from their heaters, Command ordered a reconnaissance patrol. I was assigned to it, along with 12 others and one of the civilian observers who insisted on coming. The march there felt wrong from the first step. The ice underfoot was smoother than it should have been, as if recently polished. Our boots made almost no sound. When the wind shifted, it carried no smell of smoke, no human trace at all. It was as though the camp had never existed. We reached the coordinates just after midday. Where the outpost should have stood, there was only a vast depression in the ice, a shallow basin stretching wider than the camp itself. No debris, no broken crates, no splintered timber. The perimeter stakes were gone, anchors torn free without leaving holes. It looked less like destruction and more like removal. One of the soldiers swore softly and crossed himself. Another vomited into the snow. I stepped closer to the basin's edge and felt the familiar vibration again, faint but steady, like a pulse. At the center of the depression, the ice was darker, thinner, translucent enough to show shadowy depths below. As we watched, a fracture formed, slow and careful, spreading outward in a perfect arc. Not random, intentional. We fanned out, rifles raised, though there was nothing to aim at. The civilian knelt again, pressing his instruments against the surface, hands shaking. He whispered that the readings made no sense, that the ice was under stress from below, not above. Then one of the men shouted. Near the edge of the basin, half buried in refrozen slush, lay a helmet. I recognized it instantly. Same unit markings, same dent on the rim from a fall the day before. We dug with bare hands until the cold bit too deep to ignore. Beneath the helmet was nothing. No head, no blood, just smooth ice, sealed perfectly around the object, as if it had been placed there afterward. That was when we noticed the marks. At first glance, they looked like natural scoring, long grooves etched into the ice walls of the basin. But as we moved closer, the pattern emerged. Parallel lines, even spacing, too regular to be chance. They ran vertically, from deep below up toward the surface, stopping just short of breaking through. I traced one with my glove and felt the faint warmth again. These were not cracks. They were impressions. Something had pressed upward, leaving its shape behind. And it had been enormous. The realization settled over us slowly, like frost creeping along metal. Whatever had taken the camp had not collapsed the ice by accident. It had opened it, consumed what was above, then sealed it again. Clean, efficient, military in its own terrible way. We searched for hours, expanding the perimeter, calling out names that vanished into the white without echo. No bodies surfaced. No equipment drifted free. It was as if the men had been swallowed whole. At one point, I thought I heard movement beneath my feet, a shifting far below that made the ice hum softly. I froze, heart hammering, imagining massive forms adjusting themselves beneath the surface. The civilian backed away abruptly, eyes wide, insisting we leave. He said the pressure readings were rising, that staying longer was dangerous. Command agreed, though no one wanted to turn their back on that place. As we withdrew, I looked back once more. For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw shapes moving beneath the translucent ice, tall silhouettes drifting past like shadows behind frosted glass. Then the light shifted and they were gone. That night, the mood in our camp turned grim and quiet. No one joked. No one argued. Orders were rewritten. Artillery crews were moved forward. Messages were sent south marked urgent and classified. The word anomaly disappeared from reports, replaced by terms like hostile presence and subterranean movement. We all knew those words were lies meant to comfort men who still believed this war followed rules. As I lay in my tent, listening to the distant groaning return, slower now, heavier, I understood that the outpost had not been attacked. It had been collected, and whatever had done it was still down there, marking the ice from below, deciding what to take next. We did not discover the enemy, we were finally allowed to see it. The blizzard arrived without warning, swallowing sound first, then sight. One moment the horizon was a dull gray line. The next it vanished entirely, erased by sheets of snow driven sideways with brutal force. Orders came fast, shouted through the wind, and we formed defensive positions around the camp. Rifles angled outward, artillery crews scrambling to protect their guns from freezing solid. Visibility dropped to a few yards. Men became silhouettes, then shadows, then nothing at all unless they were close enough to touch. The storm did not feel natural. It circled us, tightening as if herding prey. That was when the ice beneath us gave a sound I had never heard before. Not a crack, not a groan, but a deep, rolling split that felt like a breath being released after centuries held in. The ground shuddered. I fell to one knee, teeth clacking hard enough to hurt. Somewhere to our east, the ice shelf collapsed inward, not downward, but up, slabs rising as if pushed from below. Snow slid away from towering shapes, emerging slowly, deliberately. At first, my mind refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. I thought they were cliffs revealed by shifting snow, jagged columns of ice thrust upward by pressure. Then one of them moved. The shape straightened, unfolding to its full height, easily twice that of any man. Its surface was not smooth ice but layered. Frozen stone, packed snow, something like armor grown rather than worn. Pale blue light pulsed faintly beneath its exterior, as if veins of cold fire ran through it. Where a face should have been, there was a rough suggestion of features carved by time and frost, eyes set deep and glowing dimly like distant stars. A shout went up. Rifles cracked. The sound was pitiful in that storm, swallowed almost instantly. I fired too, muscle memory taking over, the recoil jarring my shoulder. Bullets struck the towering figure and shattered, fragments spraying harmlessly across its surface. It did not flinch. More shapes rose around it, dozens of them, forming ranks as they emerged from the ice. This was not a beast stumbling into daylight. This was an army standing up from rest. They moved with terrible calm, stepping forward as the ice sealed behind them, leaving no trace of their emergence except the faint warmth lingering on the surface. One raised an arm, thick as a tree trunk, and brought it down against the ground. The impact sent a shockwave through the camp. Men were thrown from their feet. A supply sled flipped end over end. The sound that followed was not a roar, but something closer to a command issued at low volume. The others responded instantly. They advanced in formation. Artillery opened fire. Shells detonated against their ranks, explosions flashing orange against endless white. The blasts tore chunks from their outer layers, scattering ice and stone, but beneath it all they kept moving. Where pieces broke away, new frost spread rapidly, sealing wounds before they could matter. I saw one giant strike an artillery emplacement with the back of its hand, the gun and its crew vanishing in a spray of snow and twisted metal. Another drove its foot down, cracking the ice and sending a squad sliding into darkness below. The storm seemed to obey them, winds shifting to cover their movements, snow thickening whenever we tried to focus our fire. I ran, not in retreat but sideways, dragging a wounded man whose leg bent wrong, his blood steaming as it soaked into the snow. My breath burned. My thoughts narrowed to simple things: move, don't fall, don't look back. But I looked back anyway. One of them turned its head toward me. I felt it notice me, not with anger, but recognition, as if it had seen men like me before, long ago. In that instant, images flooded my mind. Frozen battlefields not of this era. Men in hides and bronze dying beneath towering shapes. Fires extinguished by advancing ice. This war was not new. We were only the latest to wander into it. A horn sounded then, deeper and clearer than before, cutting through the storm. The giants halted as one. Those already within our perimeter stopped mid-step. The sound was not for us. It was an order recalled. Slowly, they turned back toward the fractures in the ice. Some sank downward as the surface softened beneath them. Others stepped into openings that closed seamlessly after their passage. Within minutes, they were gone. The storm eased just as suddenly, winds falling away, snow settling gently as if nothing had happened. We stood among wreckage and bodies, weapons smoking uselessly, trying to understand how an entire army could rise, strike, and vanish without leaving a battlefield behind. Command broke the silence with clipped orders, but their voices shook. Medics moved among the wounded. The dead were counted twice, as if numbers might change. I stared at the smooth ice where one of the giants had disappeared, my reflection faintly visible in its surface. We had fired every weapon we brought north, and it had meant nothing. As night crept back over the camp, one truth settled heavier than the cold. We were not facing a monster. We were standing in the middle of a war that had been buried, waiting patiently for someone foolish enough to wake it. We answered the ancient cold with modern fire, and the ice learned how we fought. By morning, the battlefield no longer looked like a place where men had died. Snow had already begun to erase us. Blood darkened the surface only briefly before freezing solid and fading beneath fresh powder. Bent rifles lay half-buried. Craters from artillery fire had softened at the edges, their violence smoothed away by drifting white. The giants had left no remains, no tracks, no proof they had ever stood among us, except the silence they left behind. Command gathered what was left of US and issued new orders, spoken without ceremony. We were to adapt. Observation was no longer enough. If the enemy rose from beneath the ice, then the ice itself would become our weapon. Engineers were ordered forward. Explosives were unpacked. Fuel reserves were rationed not for warmth, but for fire. We began preparing the glacier like a battlefield, drilling holes deep into the frozen shelf, packing them with charges meant to fracture the surface and collapse whatever lay below. The idea was simple and desperate. Deny them access to the surface by turning their world into a shifting grave. As we worked, the ground pulsed faintly beneath us, as if aware of what we were doing. The vibrations came and went, irregular now, almost cautious. Felt like something listening. When the first charges were detonated, the explosion was thunderous, echoing across the empty expanse. Ice shattered upward in jagged columns, shards raining down like glass. Steam rose where ancient cold met sudden heat. For a moment, there was a sense of triumph. We had forced a reaction. The ice cracked wide, revealing deep blue layers beneath, ancient and compacted, older than any nation represented in our ranks. Then the response came, not from below but all around us. The glacier groaned and shifted violently. Massive slabs broke free and slid toward our positions with unstoppable momentum. One artillery team was crushed before they could move. Another vanished as the ground gave way beneath them, swallowed by a widening fissure. The ice was not breaking randomly. It was collapsing tactically, targeting our emplacements, our supply lines, our escape routes. They understood pressure, weight, timing. They had learned from our explosions. The horns sounded again, closer than ever, vibrating through my chest like a second heartbeat. The giants rose in multiple locations this time, not clustered, but spread out, flanking us through the terrain itself. Fire met them head-on. Flamethrowers roared, sending arcs of burning fuel across their frozen forms. The flames clung briefly, melting outer layers, revealing darker stone beneath. For the first time, I heard something like pain. Not a scream, but a deep, resonant vibration that shook loose snow from distant ridges. They did not retreat. They advanced through the fire, steam pouring off them in thick clouds, the air filling with the smell of scorched ice and ancient earth. One of them grabbed a fuel tank and crushed it in its grip. The explosion lit the storm-bright sky orange, throwing me backward into the snow. When I struggled to my feet, ears ringing, I saw the giant still standing, its surface already freezing over again, wounds sealing as if fire itself were an inconvenience. Around me, men shouted orders that no longer mattered. We were losing ground by the second. Then came the collapse. A section of the glacier the size of a city block sheared away and slid downward, grinding over our forward line. Giants moved with it, guiding the destruction, using the shifting ice as a weapon. Entire platoons were erased without a sound, buried under tons of frozen mass. I realized then that we were not fighting them on the surface, we were fighting the surface itself, and it belonged to them. Amid the chaos, I noticed something that chilled me more than the cold. The giants were not pursuing fleeing soldiers. They were moving toward specific locations, drill sites, supply caches, command tents. They ignored isolated men unless attacked. This was not slaughter. It was reclamation. We were damaging something that belonged to them, and they were removing us with measured force. A horn call rang out, different in tone, shorter, sharper. The giants slowed, then halted. One of them turned toward a ridge where our highest command post stood. I felt that same pressure behind my eyes, the same flood of impressions. Vast frozen halls, endless winters, battles fought long before recorded time. Humans had come here before. Humans had tried fire before. The result had always been the same. Command made the decision none of us wanted to hear. A controlled collapse. We would trigger a chain detonation along the glacier's fault line, burying everything, enemy and friendly forces alike, under miles of ice. Survival was no longer the objective. Containment was. As engineers scrambled to set the charges, I took cover behind a half-buried crate, hands shaking so badly I could barely reload my rifle. The ice beneath me throbbed once, then settled, as if the giants were waiting. When the signal flare went up, blinding white against the gray sky, I understood that this war would not be won by strength or technology. It would be ended by sacrifice and silence. And as the ground began to tear itself apart beneath us, I knew that fire had only taught the frost how to kill us better. The moment I understood we were not meant to win was the moment the ice began to speak back. The detonations never came. Not at first. The engineers waited for the signal that should have ripped the glacier open and buried us all. But the charges remained silent, frozen in place as if the ice itself had swallowed their fury. A strange calm settled over the battlefield. Wind fell away. Snow drifted down in slow, delicate spirals. The giants stood motionless across the shattered expanse. Their towering forms half emerged from the ice, no longer advancing, no longer hostile. They were waiting. One stepped forward alone, moving with deliberate restraint, each footfall sending a controlled tremor through the ground. This one was different, larger. Its surface was darker, layered with ancient stone and ice so compact it looked almost metallic. Where its face should have been, faint symbols glowed beneath the frost, shifting slowly like embers buried deep in ash. Men raised rifles instinctively, but no order to fire came. Command, shaken and pale, signaled for restraint. Something in the air made violence feel wrong, premature. As the giant approached, my vision blurred, not from fear but from pressure, like my mind was being gently forced open. Images flooded in without permission, endless winters stretching back beyond memory. Human figures, smaller, desperate, marching north in eras long erased. Spears, fire, banners, then guns. Always the same pattern, always the same ending. The giant was not threatening us. It was showing us history. I dropped to one knee, gasping, hands pressed against my helmet as the weight of those memories settled. Around me, others reacted the same way. Some crying out, some weeping quietly, some staring blankly ahead as if watching a vision only they could see. Through it all, a single understanding formed clearly in my mind. This was not an invasion. It was a boundary dispute that had repeated itself for centuries. When the visions faded, the giant raised one massive arm and pointed. Not at us, but at the fractured glacier behind us, at the drill sites and collapsed ice where our explosives lay dormant. The meaning was unmistakable. We had violated something ancient. The land beneath the ice was not empty. It was theirs, claimed long before humans learned to map or name it. One of the civilian observers stepped forward, trembling but determined. He removed his gloves and pressed his bare hand to the ice, just as I had earlier. Instead of recoiling, he held it there. His breath hitched. Then he nodded slowly, tears freezing on his cheeks. "They are not waking," he whispered. "They were never asleep. We were just too loud." Command gathered quickly, voices low and urgent. No one spoke of victory anymore. The discussion turned to words like withdrawal, concealment, erasure. The giant lowered its arm and stepped back slightly, enough to make its intention clear. This was not mercy. It was an offer. Leave and the surface war ends. Stay and be removed as all others had been. A frozen accord, unspoken but absolute. The horns sounded once more, softer now, resonating through the ice like a closing door. One by one, the giants began to sink back beneath the surface. The ice parted for them smoothly, sealing again without fracture, leaving behind only faint heat signatures that faded within minutes. The battlefield was empty again, save for us and the wreckage of our ambition. That night, we dismantled what we could and destroyed what we couldn't carry. Maps were burned, instruments smashed, reports rewritten in vague, meaningless language. The civilian observers were escorted away under guard, their notes confiscated. We were ordered never to speak of what we had seen. Officially, the mission would be recorded as a geological failure, an unstable region abandoned due to environmental hazards. Unofficially, we all knew the truth. We had been judged and spared not because we were strong, but because we had finally listened. As we prepared to leave, I looked back once more at the endless white expanse. Somewhere beneath it, an army stood watch, patient and eternal, waiting to see if we would remember the lesson. And as we marched south, I could not shake the feeling that this accord was not permanent, only conditional, held together by ice that was already beginning to thin. History would later call it a retreat, but what we carried south was closer to a burial. The withdrawal began without ceremony. No victory march, no speeches, only quiet efficiency sharpened by fear. Orders came down in sealed packets, each one stamped with layers of authorization that meant questions were no longer permitted. We moved fast, but not in panic. Panic had already burned itself out. What remained was obedience and the unspoken understanding that the land was watching us leave. Columns formed at dawn, sleds packed light, wounded prioritized, the dead left behind where recovery was impossible. That decision weighed on us more than any other. Men who had fought beside us were now part of the ice, and no marker would ever bear their names. As we pulled away from the shattered zone, engineers activated the final sequence. Not the massive collapse first planned, but a controlled sealing. Charges detonated in a calculated pattern, not to destroy, but to close. The glacier folded inward on itself, layers grinding and locking together with a sound like a vast door being shut. Steam rose briefly, then vanished. Where fractures and emergence points had been, there was now only smooth, featureless white. If someone came here later, they would see nothing but untouched wilderness. That was the intent. Command wanted the war beneath the ice erased not just physically, but conceptually. We marched for days under constant escort, guards positioned as much to watch us as to protect us. No one was allowed to lag behind. No one was allowed to wander. At night, conversations were short and careful. Men spoke of home, of warmth, of things that still made sense. No one spoke of giants. The horns did not sound again, but sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, I thought I felt a low vibration beneath my boots, steady and distant, like a reminder rather than a threat. When we reached the extraction point, officials were already waiting. Men in clean coats, untouched by snow or blood. They divided us by unit, by nationality, by role. Statements were taken and immediately corrected. Words like creature, giant, army were struck out and replaced with terms like subsurface pressure event and catastrophic ice failure. Those who hesitated were reminded, politely but firmly, of treason statutes. A few men were separated from the rest and sent elsewhere. We never saw them again. I was reassigned within a week, sent to a border conflict that history remembers clearly because it was simple, men shooting men, lines on maps shifting back and forth. I fought, I survived, and eventually I returned to civilian life. But the cold followed me. Not the physical cold, but the memory of standing on ground that was alive with patience. Years passed. Empires changed. Maps were redrawn. The Arctic remained officially empty, dangerous, uninhabitable. Expeditions that strayed too far north reported equipment failures, sudden collapses, unexplained losses. Nothing conclusive. Nothing worth investigating further. That was the story, at least. In quiet circles, among men who knew how to read between official lines, there were whispers. A mining team that vanished overnight. A research station abandoned after instruments recorded rhythmic vibrations beneath the ice. Always the same explanation. Natural causes. Always sealed, classified, forgotten. I understood then that the sealing operation had not been a victory or even a truce. It was a cover-up extended across generations. We had not ended the buried war. We had hidden it and hoped time would do the rest. But time is not on our side. Even as an old man, I read reports of thinning ice, of northern passages opening where none existed before. I see photographs of exposed rock that should still be buried, of ancient layers meeting sunlight for the first time in ages. I wonder if the accord still holds, or if it was only valid while the ice remained thick enough to matter. Sometimes, in winter, when the ground freezes hard and the night is very quiet, I feel that vibration again through the soles of my feet. Not anger, not warning, waiting. We sealed them beneath the glacier, yes. But we also sealed ourselves into a lie, that war ends when it is buried. The truth is colder. Some wars do not end. They simply wait for the surface to change. I am writing this because the ice is retreating, and some things were never meant to be remembered out loud. I am an old man now. My hands shake when I write, not from age alone, but from a cold that never truly left me. Decades have passed since we marched south and pretended the Arctic was empty again. Empires that sent us there no longer exist in the same form. Uniforms have changed. Flags have changed. But the land has not forgotten. I see it in the reports I read quietly, tucked into the back pages of scientific journals and military briefings meant for very few eyes. Glaciers thinning faster than predicted. Ice shelves collapsing in places marked geologically stable. Deep seismic readings pulsing at regular intervals beneath regions no one is supposed to study too closely. They call it climate. They call it pressure. They call it coincidence. I know better. I remember the rhythm of that pulse. I remember how the ice felt alive beneath my boots. After the war beneath the ice was sealed, life continued as if obedience alone could overwrite truth. I married. I worked. I learned how to speak of that expedition as an unfortunate failure, a mission cut short by hostile terrain. When asked directly, I lied cleanly and without hesitation. That was part of the accord too, though no one ever wrote it down. Silence was the final condition, and for a long time silence held. But legends have a way of leaking through cracks. In northern villages, stories persisted of tall shadows moving under frozen lakes, of strange warmth rising from deep ice during the darkest nights. Children were warned not to wander too far inland, not because of storms, but because the ground listens. Folklore, they said, old fears dressed up to survive the modern age. The same words they used a century earlier. As the years passed, expeditions returned north with better tools and louder machines. Drills bored deeper. Sonar mapped places that had never been mapped. Each time something went wrong. Collapse. A sudden evacuation. A quiet cancellation followed by non-disclosure agreements and revised maps. I watched all of it from a distance, feeling the same helpless recognition I felt the night the giants first rose from the ice. We were repeating ourselves, confident in our progress, blind to our history. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of that elder giant, the one who showed us the memories. In the dream, it does not threaten me. It simply stands there, patient, while the ice around it thins and cracks, sunlight creeping down through layers that once blocked it completely. I wake with the certainty that the frozen accord was never permanent. It was conditional, dependent on boundaries we are now erasing ourselves. War taught me many lessons, but none as clear as this. Not all enemies are meant to be defeated, and not all territories are meant to be claimed. Some borders exist for reasons older than politics. When humans cross them, history responds. What we called frost giants were not demons or gods. They were custodians of a land shaped for them, defending it the same way any army defends its home. We were the intruders. We always were. The legend that grew from our silence painted them as monsters buried beneath the ice, waiting to rise again. That is only half true. The real horror is not that they exist, but that we know they do and continue anyway. We dig. We drill. We warm the world without listening to what stirs beneath it. One day, perhaps soon, the ice will no longer be thick enough to hold memory down. When that happens, historians will search for explanations. Soldiers will be sent north again with better weapons and the same confidence. And the land will answer as it always has. If this account survives, if anyone reads it before that day comes, then let it stand as more than a confession. Let it be a warning carved in words instead of ice. War does not always end with treaties or victories. Sometimes it pauses, waiting for arrogance to return. Legends are not born to entertain. They are born to remember what happens when humans mistake silence for safety. The war beneath the ice did not begin in 1900. That was only when we stumbled into it. And it will not end when the last glacier melts. It will end only when we finally learn that some places are not empty simply because they look that way. Some armies do not march. They wait. And some truths, once buried, are far more dangerous when uncovered again. This story is inspired by documented wartime reports, blended with folklore, and dramatized for narrative purposes.